You're listening to Errol Parker and Clancy Overall, editors of the Batuta Advocate, on Desert Rock FM. Welcome back to the Batuta Advocate radio show, recording here live from the Old City District in Batuta. You're joined by myself, Clancy Overall, and editor-at-large Errol Parker. And this week we have a titan of investigative journalism and just Australian media in general. He's visiting Batuta, but just because he's a man of that age and in Western Queensland does not mean he's retired. Chris Masters, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Far from a grey nomad.
Oh, a little bit grey, yeah. And it's still a nomad, though. My dad was a school teacher, and it was the only job where you could be a nomad and have job security.
Yeah.
So I think that got into my system a bit.
You did bounce around a little bit as kids. You mid-North Coast boy, and then educated in Sydney.
Mid-North Coast, went down to Sydney for my last couple of years.
Oh, right.
Macquarie Boys High, Ray Hadley, Ray Price territory.
Right.
Yeah. And then last year of the leaving certificate, joined the ABC straight out of school. Got married young. I was only like 20, 3 years later. And married a Gunnedah girl before it became fashionable, But I missed those country towns. So did my wife. So first chance we got. There's more to it, but we bolted back to the bush.
Yeah, right. So Gunnedah, did you spend any time there? Or?
Oh no. Well, I did at Tamworth. I was at the ABC at Tamworth.
Yeah.
I was at Albury. First day at Albury, I arrived there. Very nervous because I hadn't really broadcast before, and I'm listening to the local radio station, and the mayor of Albury, Cleaver Bunton, happened to be one of the string of broadcasters. So I can still remember the first broadcast I listened into. He said, "Here is the news from the Riverina in northeastern Victoria, prepared by Cleaver Bunton and read by Cleaver Bunton. Today, the mayor of Albury, Alderman Cleaver Bunton, said."
Oh, right.
So multi-skilling, that was the truth. Yeah, and actually, if people ask me today where I really learned investigative journalism, it was in those little communities, because you wake up in the morning and nothing's happened, and you wake up the next day and nothing's happened again. See, whereas the people who are dumped in the big city newsrooms with lots of education and mightn't necessarily get the education that matters, because they never leave the studio and they're given their stories.
You can't really teach that in a classroom, where if you dump like a young reporter into a community that's quite small that he's not familiar with, you've got to kind of work out for yourself how, to borrow one of your terms, how to get inside the tent. And that is something that you can't really teach. So how did you really learn how to get in there in the first place? Well,
when I look back on it, I think most of what I learned was outside the industry. If you wherever you come into the industry, you come into a little sort of microculture, and they teach you what they think is important. And the good thing about those stories out in the bush was, one, you had to dig, so you had to meet people. You really calibrated your moral compass. You had no choice, because if you reported on people and you were a bit too tough on them, you'd know it the next day. You couldn't be like an Alan Jones and be a coward behind the microphone and belt up everybody you liked because you'd never run into them. So that was a good thing. The other thing I think was interesting about it is that, as we Batuta boys know, when you grow up in a place like that, you talk to everybody. And this is very dangerous for journalists. So when I started doing the police corruption work, I saw there were a lot more experienced journalists around who weren't really going for that sort of stuff, and I wondered why. And then over time I came to realise that, they'd go into toxic shock at the idea of talking to somebody with a tattoo, whereas you come from a rural community. You're used to talking to the mayor, you're used to talking to the guy who cleans the gutters, the footy coach, etc.
And do you think it helps in that kind of cadetship or just outpost kind of position you're in, where you actually are a bit of an outsider too, and you're probably not looking to set up there forever?
Well, that's also true. I remember that.
You don't want to be born and raised in the town you're breaking stories in.
That was the problem. That was actually probably a big reason why I ended up back in the city, which wasn't ever what I expected. But when you do the same story and then you do it again the next year and then the next year, you start to look for challenges a little bit. And then, of course, a big story breaks in your area and you don't cover it. The guy who gets flown in from the city covers it, So I felt like I was starting to miss out a little bit too.
The ABC has a reputation now for whatever government's in power or whatever, rival media gripe they have with the ABC. There's generational stigmas that the ABC carries. Right now, there's this narrative that Ida had to come in and, belt these lefties back into line. What was the atmosphere at Auntie when you first started? Was it a little religious, or was it a little bit BBC, or what was the...
Very BBC, yeah. I was there after the dinner suit period, but still in all, everybody sounded like Oxbridge,
Yeah.
And then the stories were the stuff they talked about at North Shore dinner parties. It probably wasn't seen so much as lefty then. It was more kind of paternalistic old England. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, having talked about that rural side, that's often forgotten. Like I actually didn't come up through the inner city lefty lot. Mm. I was actually working in country town radio stations. Yeah. People voted for the National Party. Yeah. And the National Party is still a big fan of the ABC because...
They're in a lot of trouble if they say anything about them.
That's right. Yeah. It's basically Batuta and the ABC that services the bush. I'd always defend the ABC, but when I was away and I came back and I probably had a slightly different perspective on things, I would notice the left-leaning, but everybody leans some direction.
Yeah. You have any funny stories from the ABC?
Oh well, when I first joined the ABC, this goes to the notion of the ABC pluralism, of course. I was waiting at the King's Cross studios. First day, it was 1966. The commissioner was there. They used to hire these former police officers and that who'd be at the front of house. And I was sitting there waiting to be called for an interview, and a woman came rushing in a panic. And what had happened is, this is King's Cross, and she'd been flashed at out in the street, in Forbes Street. And the commissioner was looking after her, and then she started to scream even louder because the guy who flashed at her walked in, and he was on his way to work at the ABC.
So, I mean, they had the North Shore dinner party vibe, but they also had the, inner city perverts as well.
Yeah, you wouldn't be getting that at Channel 9, would you?
Now, tell us, when you started getting into the more investigative roles in town, did you kind of have to relish in that insider, outsider, you'd been to the bush, you're now in the city mindset? Because, as you said, there was a lot of people that, one, would have had trouble talking to anyone who could give them any good information about, a police pedophile sex ring or police corruption or anything like that. But also they had sources that they didn't want to burn that they'd been using for 20, 30 years.
That's right. That's why the daily rounds don't really often crack the big stories in the daily rounds.
Yeah.
The salary cap scandal was broken by Kate McClymont, not one of the sports reporters.
Not a league reporter.
Well, but my first story ever for Four Corners was the big league. It was about rugby league, and and I'm sure it happened for much this same reason. Ironically, the executive producer of the ABC at the time was brought in from Pommyland. Yeah. Jonathan Holmes, ex-Panorama, very, very smart guy.
Yeah.
And he saw what a lot of people didn't see, the need to de-pommify, Four Corners. Charles Wool used to say it was like the elephant's graveyard there, and so that was probably one of the reasons I got recruited, because I was actually working on Countrywide, from out of the rural space, and they saw some work I did, and it was in the bush, and it was different, and I didn't sound like I'd been to Cambridge. I definitely hadn't been to Cambridge. And anyway, so they pulled me in, and my brother is Roy Masters, the rugby league coach, and I was really into rugby league. I really liked it a lot, working class game. So my first story that I pitched was about professionalism in sport. It was still a little bit North Shore dinner party, but still, get.
You know, they're paying these heathens now.
That's right. Yeah, and the boot money for the rugby players and all that sort of stuff. So, and then in the course of, I worked with a great. I was really lucky. I had this producer who was an instinctive investigative reporter, Peter Manning. And I was digging in, and we were starting to hear these stories about rugby league scandals, about Kevin Humphreys, the former head of the Australian Rugby League, which it was at the time, being involved in some sort of dodgy thing, corruption. And we started looking into it, and, it suddenly had legs, and the story took, as they often do, you start doing this and it takes you in a different direction. And so we ended up with the big league, which started a Royal Commission.
You at this point are a very inconvenient person for a lot of people, probably including your brother.
Yeah. I was a problem as I realised that the story was going to do a lot of harm.
Sorry, Roy.
Yeah. I sort of tried to keep Roy out of it, and I'm sure he did pay a price for it too. He rang me up after the program went to air, and he told me he was proud of me, but at the time, it was devastating in the NRL arena.
Yeah, I guess you have spent most of your career challenging and holding to account a lot of institutions that people want to believe are pretty good to go. Keep chugging along.
Well, one of the things that I think happened is because I didn't have that traditional inner city newsroom upbringing, I didn't know what I couldn't do.
Yeah.
So I was very open-minded about taking on big institutions, and that is what I noticed about some of that early work. When the big league happened, Jonathan Holmes said to me afterwards, well, Chris, this sometimes happens. Your biggest story happens to be your first. Don't ever expect it to happen again. And I thought, I don't know. Doesn't sound right to me, And I would say that the corruption stuff kind of found me rather than the other way around. It was, people forget, in the 1980s, like at 1984, police officer with a little toddler in his arms, about to put him to bed at Chatswood, suburban Chatswood in Sydney, gets shot twice in the chest through the back of the window of his kitchen. I mean, you'd think about that happening in Colombia or Calabria, but no, it happened in Chatswood, and the cops were very crooked. It was almost like there wouldn't have been a state police force in Australia that didn't have serious institutional corruption problems, where if you worked in the armed hold-up squad, you made your money through armed hold-ups.
One for you, one for me.
If you worked in the drug squad, you basically franchised the drugs trade and just controlled it. And these stories shocked this little innocent bloke from Batuta.
I'm just glad that Bob Carr was able to stamp it all out.
Yes,
he did a great job.
I know.
What you kind of find yourself in that position a lot, where you're looking at people who have made dedicated their life to doing something. Quite often it's something that's noble, and quite often you find out that they're actually doing the exact opposite whenever they get the chance, or like almost aiding what they're trying to stop. What do you think goes on in the minds of a lot of these people? Do you think they are corrupted, say police or Defence Force or Queensland state government, or do you think they get in there because they've got an itch to scratch?
I think they become corrupted over time. I think it's almost like there's two types of people in the world. Those who believe that humans are basically decent and will do the right thing, and those who believe that you do what you can get away with, and that first person can become that second person. That's one of the things that galvanised me about the cops stuff, because you need a lot of moral energy to do this work. I mean, honestly, it's not funny. It's really, really hard and demoralising. You never talk to anybody that's cheerful. It's like I'd met so many disgruntled police officers. I was really still looking for a gruntled one. Anyway, that was the cri de coeur was this young police officer who was doing undercover work, and he's being accepting money from a superior officer, and that really meant something because that suggested systemic corruption, you know. And he didn't want to take the money because taking the money was a crime against his conscience, but not taking the money was a crime against his career. He couldn't admit that he wasn't taking the money because they wouldn't trust him. Yeah. And this just struck me as being outrageous. You know, we spend $1 billion on a police force who end up working for the other side. And I remember going into his house, and I remember him telling me the story, but not really wanting me to do anything about it. I remember his wife, you know, who taught Indigenous kids in a local school. They could have used the money. They really, they were living poor, but give them massive credit. You know, they knew that it was wrong and they didn't know what to do. So people talk about, you know, why we need journalists, why we need journalism. This is why we need journalism. You know, who else is going to do those stories? The institution was massively failing. And I think that in the cops, you know, there were almost three groups. There were the Boy Scouts who would never do the wrong thing. Therefore, they were never trusted and just put in benign areas. Mm-hmm. You know, there were the tough guys, the hard guys who drank with all the crooks and knew all the stuff. They'd become criminals, perhaps without realising it. They probably did. And you know, they were kind of the heroes of the police force, the bad guys. And then the biggest group is the group in the middle that just has to find a way to operate. You know, so see no evil, hear no evil.
And so the prefects who go straight from, you know, school captain to the police force, who imagine they're going to follow the same trajectory, just stay at the bottom. Yeah,
and that becomes very demoralising for the ones. That was one of the good things that happened, I think. That, I mean, people say that you'll never reform the police force, and corruption will never go away, which is true enough. But there are significant differences between the police force of today and the one that I saw in the early 80s, you know, where coppers who got on were the ones who got on the piss at lunchtime, you know, and now they kind of go to the gym, or, you know, they go home to their wife and
get sleeve tattoos.
Yeah.
Well, it's one thing to take what you learnt as a journalist in a small town and applying that to, say, to rugby league or to a police force, but the first time you won a gold Logie, correct me if I'm wrong, was investigating the sinking of the Rainbow Warrior, which was done by the French Special Forces.
Yeah, DGSE.
Yeah. How did you manage to take what you learnt investigating, you know, the cops, the rugby league, being a journalist in a small town? How do those skills help you with your first kind of overseas
big investigation? It was a very unusual story in that it was a big international story that happened to occur in our backyard. I mentioned Peter Manning before. He really should get a lot of credit for that, because it was that sort of hanging around typewriters forever that somehow gave him an instinct that there was something more to this story. Because when it first happened, people didn't know the French Secret Service were behind it. You know, some lunatic ex-Vietnam vet or someone like that, you know, with a grudge against the Greenies. But anyway, he said, go over to Auckland, Chris, and have a look into this. And he said, and you better take a backup story, you know, like my backup story was the New Zealand economy, you know. So
wool's still good.
So I actually had the file, the New Zealand economy file, and taken from the ABC archive, and then read on the plane. And I think the first meetings I had were with business people and stuff like that. But then I turned up at the local cops, and then it started to break in front of me. It was classic old style, wear out shoe leather type journalism. You know, you got to get out of the office. And here's a great story, I reckon. It's the moment that I knew that something was on with that story was when I was sitting with a New Zealand police officer who was on the case. The local journalists nicknamed him Lockjaw because he wouldn't tell us anything. We'd been out and about, we'd been checking out a few things, we'd been to the car rental agencies, and the pattern started to form, and I started to think the French Secret Service are behind this. And I went into the police station and I was just talking to Lockjaw, and I said, do you know what? I think the French Secret Service are behind this. And it was just the look on his face. That's all. You'd never pick it up over the phone, let alone the internet. But the look on his face said to me, he agreed with me, you know. And so, you know, we poured everything into it. And it was probably the only story that I ever did that was like an adventure story.
Yeah.
It's how you wish journalism was, because it was exciting. Not to forget that it was built on the death of somebody. You know, journalism is also like being a vulture sitting on the top of the tree. But, you know, I went to Noumea and chased them around the world, ended up in Paris, got to Paris and knew that this was an international story, knew that I was well in front of the media pack, thought what was I going to do, and I did a little bit of information trading, you know, which is what happens in security intelligence circles and journalism. And I thought, who would be the Brian Toohey of France? You know, who would be the guy that has good spy contacts? And we found such a guy. I met him and I said to him, look, I know a lot about what happened in New Zealand. It's going to be a big story here. Can you help me connect me to a few of your sources? And he did. And then, you know, the timing was exquisite. The program went to air on the same night that the lead story in the news was that France had looked into this issue and had nothing to do with the sinking of the Rainbow Warrior. And then we put this program to air that demonstrably proved otherwise. And it got shown all around.
They could have just held off on denying it by about 24 hours and it would have looked much less corrupt.
Yeah.
Did that cause an international incident? Did that cause...
Oh,
I mean, I remember the rugby matches and all the and to this day, France and New Zealand. You know, the Kiwis talk shit about the French to this day.
Well, you know, I remember talking to the Australian Foreign Minister at the time, and he privately told me, "Look, Chris, this is the problem with being a really small country like Australia or New Zealand." He said, "The superpowers can shit on us if they want to, and they do." And when we were in Noumea and they thought we were New Zealanders, you know, they were spitting on us like, you know, how dare you complain about us invading your sovereignty? And you know, there was a boycott on French lamb and all that sort of stuff. But it did. It crashed all down around their ears. Arnoux was the French defence minister, and he got sacked. I felt a bit sorry for the DGSE people, you know, because they were spies doing their job, and they ended up getting locked up in a New Zealand prison. It was funny because the other thing about that story, of course, is it's television, you know, and television is mostly entertainment. You know, it's this hybrid form where you put journalism together with documentary making and, you know, with what's going to win. And I had to make a television program that people would want to watch, and I'm interested in filmmaking, and it was a perfect TV story, but there's nobody to interview, so what do? You need a vehicle to tell the story. The vehicle literally was the vehicle. What had happened is the French Secret Service had hired a Newman's camper van, and they were driving around in it pretending to be holiday makers. Then they put it in at the airport, and this is why you don't commit terrorism in a village. The reason they got found out is because when they were going to drop the bomb onto the Rainbow Warrior, when they came back ashore, there was a neighbourhood watch group that were watching out because there'd been pilferage on the yachts in Auckland Harbour, and they spotted this camper van and they wrote down the number plate.
Wow!
And they reported to the cops, and then the bomb goes off. The cops have this report. They trace the camper van. They're waiting at the airport when Prieur and Maffard, the French couple, turn up to take it back, and that's how they were taken into custody. So they did their, you know, forensics, which wasn't anything like CSI. I think it probably took about half an hour, you know. They did their forensics, and then the the camper van went back to Newman's, and we turned up the next day and say, can we rent that camper van?
Yeah.
All right.
And we did. We rented the exact camper van that the Secret Service people used, and then we just simply used it to retrace their steps and filmed the whole thing.
Really? And so that added to the kind of theatrical element of the report on the TV show. But did they leave anything around? Did they leave anything?
Well, they had a party. That was the thing about.
They were all right. They were spies, but they were also French.
They were French, yeah. And I mean, one of them had an affair with a New Zealand police officer's wife. And that was the camper van thing, the number plate being written down, that actually happened twice. There was a second group of them that met up in a forest, all very spooky, and somebody saw this group of people meeting in a forest, and they thought that it was dodgy, so they actually wrote down that number plate as well. So the French thought they were going to the South Pacific to have this mighty party, but they didn't realise that everything they do would be noticed.
Yeah, in these small coastal towns, yeah. And they just, because of the teenagers who'd been stealing stuff from boats over the weeks prior, the French Secret Service were...
They must have thought they were so clever too.
Now, as you said, that was a big international story. And I guess this is another big story you did for Four Corners was almost international under Sir Joe's Queensland. It really wasn't much like Sydney at that point.
The Moonlight State.
The Moonlight State.
Yeah. Well, here's my one joke about the Moonlight State. I used to say, you could see corruption. It was visible. Just have they had the big prawn and the big pineapple and whatever. They should have had the big penis in Fortitude Valley. It's like it was so obvious, and all the coppers dining in the Chinese restaurants, for free, which was their given, but nobody doing anything about it. In many respects, the local media also gets drawn into it. Terry Lewis had been made Father of the Year, and he was being promoted as a great guy, and people are getting their stories as the cops are giving them drops, etc. Anyway, I used to think that all these coppers chewing on the gristle of corruption at the Chinese restaurants, if the AFP couldn't get them and the NCA wouldn't get them, then the MSG might.
Very, very cultured, corrupt police officers too, with their sweet and sour pork. That was very, very experimental for Queensland in the 80s. So just quickly, I mean, there was the Moonlight State, and of course then they revisited it with Willacy on ABC Four Corners about 3 years ago when they'd released a lot of documents that had kind of been sealed.
There was a lot that I didn't know.
Yeah.
It was funny because investigative journalism tends to be, the dangers tend to be overstated. It's dangerous to work in investigative journalism in Colombia and Indonesia, but it's not so dangerous in Australia, so I don't want to play that up. But I have to say, based on retrospectives, they would have killed me if they'd have known what was coming, because there was $1 billion enterprise there that and suddenly everything was at stake. Politicians, senior lawyers, not just the brothel owners, that they could simply go to jail because of this program. And the federal police did know things were going on because they were conducting phone taps, and they were
fairly new at that point?
They'd been the Commonwealth Police, and they weren't long the federal police, and they tended to be disparaged by the state police. But they had powers that meant that they could look into stuff, and they kept seeing that jobs were being blown, and they knew the cops were crook.
Yeah.
Anyway, I got in touch with a federal police officer who ended up becoming a good friend of mine. He was on that program. His name's Dave Moore. And he started looking out for me. I always thought I initiated the contact. Yeah. It wasn't until he told me years later that actually they were worried about me. They thought that I could come to significant harm because I was starting to knock on too many doors, and the bad guys in the Queensland cops, and let alone the criminal community, were starting to become a little bit unnerved. So they actually made no secret of their connection to me. I mean, I was staying in the Tower Mill Hotel up on Wickham Terrace.
Yeah.
They told me to not use the phones. You know, the phones were being tapped.
Well, what was the old Saints song? The walls have eyes, the phones have ears.
Yeah.
I used to, knowing that that they were coming in and searching my room, I used to write bullshit stuff on the notepad.
Yeah.
And then I'd tear the paper off, you know, because I knew they'd read the imprint. And
give them dodgy tips for race 8.
And I'd come down and go and use the local phone booth, and whenever I used the local phone booth, somebody in sensible shoes would move into the neighbouring one, you know, and so they were telling the feds.
This is a special branch under Sir Joe.
I think it was the BCI, the Bureau of Criminal Intelligence.
Yeah.
And they, I remember being in the room at the Wickham Terrace and Dave taking me over to the curtain and saying, "See that brown Kingswood down there? That's a BCI car." You know, they'd traced the number plate back. They used to rent old wrecks and, you know, use them for cops work. One of the good things about developing anti-tailing, people following you, is just be a shithouse navigator.
Yeah.
Because one time I was driving down onto the freeway and realised I was going the wrong way, and I was about to turn onto the on-ramp and I didn't want to. So I sort of put the brakes on and looked in the rearview mirror to see if I could back up, and I saw this car full of cops behind me.
So just to summarise for the listeners who might be a bit young and maybe only grew up under the extremely non-corrupt Beattie, Bligh, Newman governments, Sir Joe, 1980s Queensland, but the back end, 1987, you released Moonlight State. And just to quickly summarise what was very much a very, very complex and probably well put together criminal organisation, there was a bribe syndicate going from street level organised crime to the police to potentially higher than that. And actually I think that you did find it was higher than that. And there was a bag man running. The bag man was Jack Herbert. They nicknamed the Joker, and of course the joke was on everybody. Yeah. The critical piece of evidence that was uncovered was the link between the underworld and the police hierarchy. The syndicates, as they were known, there were two major brothel cum illegal gambling syndicates. They would channel the money through Jack Herbert. Yeah. Who was the bag man. He was a pick-up, drop-off.
And he used to be a licensing branch. He never rose beyond sergeant, ex-British copper. I caught up with him afterwards. You know, we actually spent a bit of time together, and his wife hated me. I could remember her sort of staring daggers at me in the kitchen, but, you know, he knew it wasn't personal, and we, strangely enough, we were kind of bonded, I think, by such an intense experience. He was a funny guy, really was. He admitted, and dishonest, you know, in that he'd say, "Oh, my problem was, Chris, I was greedy, you know, I just loved money." But he also loved his family, and they got him in England. He pissed off to England, and they sent the Prime Minister's jet to pick him up. So he was such a big witness, you know, and he rolled. His old mates, of course, hate him for that. But look, they all roll. Yeah. You know, the jails are full of people who roll, no matter what they say. Anyway, Jack became a protected witness, and they thought there was this massive price on his head, so they were watching him as closely as they could. But he kept turning up at his family's house, or they kept spotting him with his family, and they couldn't figure out why. What happened is that they put him in an apartment on the Gold Coast, and they knew that
sounds like a nice safe place for someone who may be bringing down the Bjelke-Petersen government.
Well, that's where he lived. He lived on one of the sort of canal estates, but anyway, what he used to do was he'd get his beach towel and hang it over the balcony, and his wife and family would drive around the Goldie looking for that beach towel, and so they kept finding him all the time.
I mean, there was the sex trade that was happening, which was all, and it's all very funny as well. I mean, in terms of the theatrical element you have to offer in the documentary side of things, this was one of the most conservative governments we've seen in Australia at a state level, particularly. So you had this hardcore Lutheran Sir Joe Bjelke-Petersen, who flat out banned condoms in Queensland.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of people in his government and definitely the police force that were overlooking illegal brothels and casinos and marijuana. There was the North Queensland, the Italian connection from North Queensland.
That's
was
right.
bringing in dope.
Yeah. And more than that.
Yeah.
And they, Joe couldn't stop the devil at the border, but he pretended he could. And in some respects, also the power of television. If you had to look at what really made a difference with that program, and lots of other journalists worked on it, and lots of other journalists deserve a lot of credit for the hard work they put into it. Looking back at it purely academically, trying to sort of figure out what it was that, tipped that over the edge and it made it a big issue. Well, one of the issues probably was simply taking the cameras into the girly bars, because that National Party heartland couldn't deny the imagery. It was so... To many people it would have been benign, but, they were genuinely shocked. There was some criticism that we shouldn't have put such lascivious stuff to air, but I actually reckon it actually helped a lot.
Well, even that's how powerful the movement was behind Joe, in terms of his Trumpian kind of, the original Trump with his elections and his campaigning. He was flipping Labor seats in inner city Brisbane to the National Party. So New Farm would have been... New Farm, Fortitude Valley was the National Party seat. And a lot of Australia... a lot of Queensland was kind of adhering to those kind of values. So you definitely would have blown a lot of lids in terms of the base. He seemed omnipotent, and of course absolute power absolutely corrupts, and that's really what went wrong for him. What I didn't realise at the time was that his power base was crumbling. He had done the sort of Joe for Canberra tilt, and that didn't work so well. And the thing about corruption is it's not just a moral issue; it's also a practical one. If you generate corruption, that means the bad guys win. Yeah. So the crappy developers were getting the good jobs as against the more reputable developers who were thinking, well, we paid money to the National Party, but we didn't pay enough, And so there was beginning to be a bit of a backlash, I think. I hadn't really seen that coming, but some of my allies, some of the people who supported the Fitzgerald inquiry were actually members of the National Party, who'd seen this going wrong. So there's a funny story in the middle of all this in the Moonlight State. There was two coppers in Fortitude Valley who had a very intense night on the job one night where they kind of revealed to one another that they were both good guys.
You're talking about the...
Cole Dillon?
Oh, Cole Dillon.
Yeah,
right.
So he was the young Aboriginal officer in Fortitude Valley who'd...
They gave him a bottle of scotch or something,
And he joined the police force for all the good reasons, to help his people and, reconciliation and all that kind of stuff. And then the scotch bottles just kept appearing in his locker.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And that's one of the things about the crooked cops is they did have an antennae for one another. They would be able to sniff one another out. But thankfully it was also true of the other guys, they tended to find one another. And the whole story opened up for me because one of Cole's mates, a police officer called Jim Slade, who was the one I mentioned at the beginning, who was sitting in the room not wanting to tell me the story, undercover cop who'd been offered a bribe by his superiors. He'd actually gone to a police college and shared a room with an intel guy from Canberra, from the Australian Bureau of Crime Intelligence, called Peter Vassallo. Peter was the expert on Italian organised crime. So Peter was the one who told me about Jim and Cole, etc., and that's why I went up to Queensland.
So just quickly before we go, Chris, I just want to ask you how you were able to, this is obviously a few years later, turn your focus onto a personality as opposed to an organisation with your work on Alan Jones, and how you've been able to forge a career in the years after you've gone after the only man in the Australian media that you simply cannot talk about at all.
Well, there was an institution, and that, of course, was our own institution, this very institution, broadcasting, you know.
Is this your first talkback radio interview ever?
Well, I remember thinking, you know, when Peter Ryan was the police commissioner, Bob Carr, you mentioned before, was the premier. Peter Ryan was an honest guy, you know, probably a bit out of the loop, you know, didn't really know what was going on. He was brought in from England. In fact, he lived in my street. I knew him a little bit, and we weren't friends or anything. But he ends up being rolled by this sort of ugly cabal of people that I didn't have any respect for, you know, and Carr let that happen. And I just thought, boy, this guy, Jones, is powerful, no doubt about it, you know. And I thought, yes, he works in my same industry, but I think, you know, you must challenge power and abuse of power wherever you see it. By the way, you know, Alan Jones and I were both inducted into the Australian Media Hall of Fame on the same night. The people, they put me up first because they knew that if I knew that Jones was going to get one as well, I wouldn't have turned up, and I wouldn't have either. It just says a lot about our industry, doesn't it? You know, we couldn't be more different, but in you don't have to have the same values to be elevated in the media industry.
Do you find people you wouldn't have even thought was in the inner circle were in the inner circle giving you calls?
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
you know.
Because you ended up writing a rather big book about,
Sure, yeah.
about
Yeah.
the man, the institution.
Because I'm sure that if we wrote an article about Alan Jones this afternoon, the phone would ring.
Yeah, there's there are a lot of witnesses out there, and I think the story isn't over. But I mean, a classic interview would be like this. I would go into the office, a very well-appointed office of a high liberal person, and he would say to me, "Look, Chris, I know Alan is toxic. You know, I know that he's a stain on democracy, but it just doesn't pay to oppose him. So the only way we can deal with him is to let him think we're doing what he wants to do, but we can never attend to his demands, because if we do, we're in massive trouble."
Do you find, at this point, your own brother is now a rugby league icon. Did you find that comes as an advantage as being Roy's brother? You weren't necessarily jumped on as hard as, you know, some...
Maybe I'm still Roy's brother.
Yeah.
I introduced myself as Roy's brother. I think that, look...
Because those circles overlap as well with this book.
They do. And Roy has... Look, Roy's one of the best, if not the best, sports reporter in Australia, I think. You look at his contacts, they are brilliant. And they're at every level. I mean, he really knows the game, but he's also got an economics degree. You know, he also knows the politics and the economics of the game. And I think what we have in common is we both recognise that the best sources are middle-level sources. Yeah. A lot of senior journalists, they only talk to the elite. The elite will only ever tell them what they want them to know. They'll get big stories all the time, but they don't really realise they're being fed. Low-level sources can be quite helpful, but they don't know that much. Mid-level sources are the best, and that's Roy's very well connected to them.
But just one more thing I want to get your thoughts on is that this type of extended reporting is quite expensive. You've got to pay these reporters to be working on a story for a couple of years maybe. And journalism, as we know it now, in its traditional forms, is shrinking, basically because of the money issue that no one really wants to pay for journalism anymore. Where do you see it going from here?
I think it'll take a generation. I don't think there's clearly a need for journalism. There's clearly a need for Nick McKenzie and Kate McClymont. And I think the new generation of journalists are actually better than my generation. And I think the main reason for that is they're in a fight for their professional lives, and they know it. Whereas when I came into the business, I could have a 25 years career at Four Corners. I'm not sure that is possible anymore.
So they're fighting to avoid getting a job as a press secretary.
Basically.
It's hard. They should invest more in investigative journalism because it's the story that launches 1,000 stories.
Yeah.
It not only validates us and not only gives us credibility with the public, but it also sells a lot of newspapers and rates very well. But it is extremely expensive and costly, but mostly costly to the practitioners, I have to say. Kate just got an award, I think, and she talks like I talk about the sort of stress and pressure of endless court cases and waking up to the sound of your own heartbeat, your blood pressure. And Nick is a fabulous reporter, and it's nearly exhausted him. He's only 40, and it'll wear him out really quickly. I had to kind of find a way to measure it. You become obsessive. You become your own worst enemy. Nobody wants to talk to you at a dinner party. You become Scotty from marketing. And so I used to think, well, I can't just be investigative. I have to be reflective. I have to do some stories that aren't completely dependent on revelation.
How do you, and it's changed so much probably since you first started, where you could actually just be, people would look and take your work for what it was, I guess, pre-internet, it's probably pre-internet, pre-culture wars. You could just say, look, I'm not a diehard greenie, but I am interested in the French Secret Service blowing up a Greenpeace boat.
Of course.
But if you ran that story nowadays, you'd be getting hammered for your agenda.
Yeah.
How do you think that's going to, do you reckon that also will have to balance out, a new etiquette will have to develop?
I think the old etiquette should hold, that journalists aren't campaigners, that they understand what a fact is, and the art is to make what is important interesting. Stories are extremely complicated, and there's sometimes joy in the complexity, and that's where the craft is. This whole notion that we tell the stories through the prism of the left or the prism of the right is ridiculous in my view. And when I see journalists who think the main game is whatever their beef happens to be, I think they could use a bit of objectivity. And I think some of those old notions of fairness and balance, which got massively disparaged through my career, are actually really important. It's fair enough, you can say that it is impossible to understand an absolute truth, and none of us are completely objective, but there's no reason not to try. And it's the trying that's what makes you proud of journalism.
Well, we try and uphold those values here in the Queensland Channel Country. Chris, thank you for joining us. It's a great honour. Everything we've just spoken about here were all from different corners of the country, different corners of the planet, and are all stories that people in our trade talk about, and they talk about it at uni, they talk about it on the job. So yes, very an icon, as I mentioned at the start. Thank you for joining us.
Good on
Thank you.
Thank you.